Alright, listen up. Today we talk dungeons. Today we talk Mythic Plus, we talk how it's been going this week compared to last week. A few days ago, there was this YouTuber called Eisenart who made a video talking about how exactly last week went in Mythic Plus. Last week we had Fortified, we had Volcanic, and we had Bursting. Looking at all the dungeons and what was the success rate of each dungeon for each group. How likely were you to complete your key, to not deplete the key and be successful? Looking at all the keys of all levels, +2, +7, +10, +15, and then all the keys above level 12. This time around, as we go through the dungeons, we're going to be looking at how are they doing in all the keys with the prideful affix, all the keys with the seasonal affix, so 10 and higher. Are they going to be the same as last week? Do you have the same chance of completing your key as last week? Are you wrong? Did you just decide that you don't want to do Sanguine Depths because it's too hard and you should totally do Necrotic Wake because it's easy, even though the numbers are saying nope? So let's go and take a look as we walk through each of the dungeons and how are they this week. So last week for the high keys, this is what we were at. We had an over 75% chance of completion pretty much just for Mists of Tirnaseath and a very, very low chance for the other side at basically 14%. All the others were varying between 25 and 50, with the only odd one out being Halls of Atonement. Now this week we have some confirmations. We have the confirmation of Mists and the other side, the Ardenweald Dungeons. Mists of Tirnaseath remains the easiest of all dungeons. It is very quick compared to the others, and on Tyrannical is not that difficult either. The last two bosses, Mistcaller and Tredova, aren't really that difficult. Some of the bosses, as you might have noticed, have some sort of softened rage mechanics. They start filling up the room with shit you have to dodge and then you have no more space, or they start getting a stacking buff, they start spawning more and more adds. Those two bosses don't really have anything. You just can repeat their phases over and over and over and it's gonna be fine. They also have a bunch of abilities that are avoidable. So the damage is high, but as long as you dodge, you're taking very little damage. Like Mistcaller, you can CC the ad that spawns before letting him blow up. You can dodge the bolts, you can stop the tank slap, and then all you have left is the AoE in the intermission. You can repeat it rather easily. Tredova, the last boss, while being somewhat confusing, somewhat hectic, somewhat busy with all the mechanics going around, a lot of that can simply be dodged. The two different types of circles on the ground can fully be dodged. The ads can fully be kited and avoid them completely. And his parasitic infection can be completely interrupted. So in Tyrannical it's not that difficult, and Mists remains the easiest dungeon even this week. And it's likely it's going to stay this way until it gets buffed. Regardless of the affix, regardless of the key level, it's going to remain the easiest dungeon. As for the hardest dungeon though, it does remain the other side. While Mists went from 77.5 to 79.5 success rate, so very, very similar, very, very easy, we do have at the very least some significant improvement from the other side. The other side was at 13.4, now it's at 27.3, at all keys at 10 or higher. So a little bit better. It does remain a pretty tough dungeon in Tyrannical though. This dungeon on Tyrannical, it is surprising. It is not clear whether or not the success rate has improved, simply because people now have more item level, they have more gear, they have already wiped long enough last week on the other side, so now they can do it much better. Because Tyrannical, the other side, should be harder than Fortified. All of their bosses on Tyrannical can scale to pretty nasty levels. Hakar is a pretty tight DPS check because of the blood barrier. The Mana Storms is also a pretty tough encounter in Tyrannical. You have a tank buster, basically you have a DOT that hits very hard. You have to also properly do all of the mechanics, particularly centered around stunning the bosses to interrupt them from just doing tons of damage, particularly the AoE at the end of the Wife Mana Storm phase, and even Dealer Zayaxa, which was sort of discounted before, but in Tyrannical, the higher you go in keys, Arcane Lightning is going to be more and more of a problem because of the very high single target damage, and eventually the healer will run out of cooldowns. Eventually there's not going to be anything left and you have to kill her in time, or you just can't keep up with the damage. But Regardless, the other side has definitely improved. Mist has only improved by 2% in success chance, whereas the other side has gone up 14%, so noticeable increase. Now, moving on to the Bastion Dungeons. Now, the Bastion Dungeons have gotten some bad rep, I guess, from the comments I've seen, from the perceived difficulty of the dungeons. So, last week, they were sitting at basically 26 and 30% success rate. Now, they are at 55 and 52. There has been a 29% increase in success chance for Spires of Ascension and a 23% increase for Necrotic Wake. Now you have an over half, over 50%, so you can have a weighted coin in your favor when you try to do Necrotic Wake or Spires. Both dungeons, though, this is also pretty interesting because both dungeons should be amongst the harder to complete in Tyrannical. Shouldn't be the week that favors these two dungeons. Spires of Ascension, you do have some sort of, you do have some probably sort of pseudo enrage on Ventunax. You have this soft enrage of all of the Shadow Whirls, all of the balls on the ground, becoming more and more and more until you just get hit and die. Orpheurion is also somewhat of a soft DPS check because it's going to have some hard healing on the single target hit, the Purifying Blast, and then his intermission phase. You are going to eventually run out of immunities, out of defensives to soak all of that, and eventually you just risk dying. Ironically, the last boss, Devos, is the easiest in terms of scaling because the lingering debuff can be dispelled, can be mass dispelled, can be removed by immunities, and you can also get some, pretty quick classes, quick specs to get to those spheres and immediately end the phase and start again. And the normal phase is not that difficult, it's not that damaging. The Mega Explosion can be avoided. Of course, it still does damage inside the bubble, but much less, and the charge also can be avoided, so not that difficult on that hand. Necrotic Wake, you have seen my past few videos. There has been basically a change a day with the Necropolis, the Mutilate and the Tenderize of those mobs, as well as the boss, Stitch Flesh. You do have problems where you have you have Amarth, the second boss, which is also soft enrage. Because of his AoE, the Harvest is going to keep doing more and more damage. Stitch Flesh himself with Mutilate is going to be doing more and more damage. You do have the Saving Grace, more or less, that it's going to be a cycle phase, so you can save your cooldowns when he's not up, and then pull them up when he comes, but that's also pretty tough in Tyrannical. And the last boss as well. The last boss requiring a DPS check on his shield, on his Icebound Aegis to break, otherwise you keep taking AoE damage, and then there is the problem that the room is going to get filled with the ice on the ground, giving you less and less time to complete the encounter. So it is surprising, at the very least, to know that over half of these two dungeons are likely to succeed if you join a key for these two dungeons. Then we have the Maldraxxus Dungeons. We have Plagueful and Theater of Pain. So the increments to Plagueful and Theater of Pain are much lower than Spires of Ascension and Necrotic Wake. Although, to be fair, they are also lower increases because they were much higher to begin with. Spires and Necrotic Wake were at 25 and 29 last week. Last week, Plagueful and Theater of Pain were at 48 and 40% success chance. This week, with Tyrannical, they go from 48 to 55 for Plagueful, and from 40 to 48 for Theater of Pain. So more or less an 8% increase on both of them in terms of success chance. Now Plagueful is at 55.6% completed keys, and Theater of Pain is at 48.1. It's an interesting number because Theater of Pain ideally should be easier than Plagueful. In fact, it should probably be easier than Necrotic Wake and Spires of Ascension as well. None of the bosses on Theater of Pain are particularly damaging, are particularly threatening, except Kultarok. Kultarok is, of course, the boss with the Phantasmal Parasite debuff, which is going to hit very hard on single target, and then you have the Draw Soul mechanic, which is going to hit also for a lot. Unavoidable, because first you have to get drawn in by the Grasping Hands on the ground, and you take ticking damage, and then you have to move out, take your soul, you take ticking damage again, and it's going to be very high on the healer to deal with this. As well as the DPS being pretty understanding of what's going on. If you're an off-spec, you should heal some of these players as they are taking heavy damage. It's not going to hurt. And then you have the last boss, which isn't really difficult in terms of numbers. It's just about dodging. You have to dodge the beam. You have to dodge the charges of the ghosts. And the ghosts, when they spawn, basically avoid being pulled in. So all these things can be fully and completely avoided. It's just about actually doing it. There is no real hard damage, hard unavoidable damage being thrown in to the party like on Kultarok. This is going to be more about hoping that people can move their feet, basically. Which is also why probably, if we look at pugs, which is what we are looking here, most of these numbers come from pugs, not from coordinated groups, why Theater of Pain has a much lower win rate, a much lower success rate than other dungeons, even though technically it should be easier. As for the other dungeon, Plagueful. Plagueful is pretty nasty. It's pretty annoying, particularly because it is very backloaded. The hard stuff is at the end, not at the start, so you only know if you're gonna fail, if it's gonna be terrible at the end, because it's gonna be about Domina, Venomblade, and Margrave Stradama, the last two bosses, with also very little trash in between. You kill Domina, and then you go up, or rather down, to Stradama, and in 2 minutes you can go for her. So Domina, of course, has the issue where you have to always be stuck together, and then you have to spread if you get Shadow Ambush, and then you have to spread to pick up the assassins. Of course, you can pick them up with things like stuns, flares, traps, all sorts of things from range, but most of the time, as a tank especially, you want to do a little circle and pick them all up. So there's a bunch of movement. It's also annoying this week because we have Storming. Storming spawns next to mobs, you stack on top of the boss, you pick up all the adds on top of the boss, you're gonna have all the Storming spawn in front of you, and you want to stay together because of the mechanic of the fight, but there is Storming around, so it becomes pretty annoying. Domina also puts a pretty nasty poison on the tank, so you want to have a poison dispel to help the tank a lot. And then when you go down to Stradama, it's a disease dispel, because the hardest part of Stradama is moving your feet, similar to Theater of Pain last boss, the tentacle slams, that's one. The other one is Infectious Rain, the heavy damage dealing debuff. This is particularly important because you often see in pugs people not using their own defensives. You see a druid, a balanced druid with a restoration affinity and Heart of the Wild, there are no adds up. Stradama just went untargetable, everyone is getting hit by Infectious Rain, and the balanced druid is rolling his stumps. That's a good scenario to actually help the group. What I also noticed in this dungeon is that people tend to ignore the small guys, and they end up being the biggest source of wipes because they walk next to a guy and they two-shot him. But still, all things considered, 55.6% success rate for Plagueful is actually pretty surprising. At the end of the day, it has currently a higher success chance than Theater of Pain, Necrotic Wake, Spires of Ascension, and Other Side. So at the moment, it's the second best dungeon for you to do, after Mists of Tyrannacid. So, surprising. I wouldn't have guessed Plagueful to be this successful so far. However, we have to talk about the last two, the Revendreth Dungeons. These are the more surprising to me, the most surprising to me. Because when we look at last week we had Sanguine Depths at a 34% success rate and Halls of Atonement at 66%. So we were being told the trash in Sanguine Depths is cancer. On Fortified Weeks, it's breaking too many keys. On the other hand, the trash in Halls of Atonement is easy. So you can just go by all of them and then breeze through the bosses because it's not tyrannical. So this week, Sanguine Depths win rate went a little over 65% from 33.8, increasing by 32%, literally almost doubling in win rate. Meanwhile, Halls of Atonement went from 65.5 to 61. So we finish the Shadowlands dungeon in the second week of Mythic Plus, with Halls of Atonement being the only dungeon which has gotten worse over time. All the dungeons combined have gotten something like a 15% increase in win rate, except for Halls of Atonement. Halls of Atonement aside, being the only one decreasing. So we have to talk about what's going on in Sanguine Depths doubling its win rate from a Fortified week to a Tyrannical week, and Halls of Atonement getting even worse. So for Halls of Atonement, it's not probably that difficult. Halls of Atonement trash wasn't that difficult to begin with. The only real check were kiting away the dogs when they would get mad, if they would get mad, and then just dealing with the trash on the big golem. That was it. Most of the other stuff was manageable. This week, though, that became sort of like an afterthought. It wasn't really needed to worry about trash without Fortified, but it's Tyrannical, so you have to deal with bosses. So the first boss is kind of a joke. The third boss, High Educator Release, is also a joke, especially after they fixed it. Now the jars are gonna keep respawning, so you're always gonna be able to just take away the ghosts and be fine with it. The two problems were Echelon and the Lord Chamberlain. So Echelon, of course, as the problem of the ad. How do you pick up the ads? You have to group them all together, and then you have to be able to stomp on them with the cursed guy. That's going to get the Curse of Stone and then the jump on the boss. On top of this, you're going to get the pools spawning on the ground. So eventually, you're going to get a situation where there's going to be a bunch of ads. Some of the ads are going to get stuck on top of the pools. You won't be able to interrupt them all. Maybe you don't have a DK. You don't have mass grip. You don't have people that can knock back them away. So eventually they get all spread. So your stomp from the boss can't even clear half of them. So they keep resurrecting. There are going to be more pools on the ground. You're going to take more, accidental damage. All those little shits are going to keep throwing their bolts at you for more and more damage, and you can't keep up. So that was the main check for Echelon. For Chamberlain, really literally the only thing in the entire fight is people to not get like one shot by some bouncing ball of being thrown around by the moving statues, and then Ritual of Woe. I have my own experience with a +11 key getting there with 0 deaths in time to chest it, and then we just disband the entire group because 2 people don't soak and we insta-die and people rage quit. It's not that difficult. I don't even know if it's intended, but you can even right now soak two of these rays at the same time on top of the boss, particularly with an immunity, but I'm not sure if this is intended, if it's planned. But either way, that's really the only thing you have to worry about. Even on Tyrannical, when you have to go to at least 2 phases, you can go by with your defensive and then a health potion, and you should be fine. But in the end, the difference in win rate is sort of understandable. The bosses are probably going to create more problems than the trash in Halls of Atonement. But the real change, though, is Sanguine Depths. Because if you ask around, people are going to tell you that Sanguine Depths is cancer because of the trash, and other people are going to tell you that Sanguine Depths is awful because of the bosses. Well, if we judge by numbers, Sanguine Depths is definitely not awful because of the bosses, because on Tyrannical Week, it doubled its success chance and is currently the 2nd most successful dungeon to do this week. So we have to take out immediately General Kyle, the last boss, because it's definitely undertuned. It's not really doing many things too dangerous. As long as you can do the sidestep before the beams and then spreading for Wicked Rush, it should be fine. The main issues were the first 3 bosses. Crixus, the first boss, can be a problem with Living Essence, the things you sort of blow up and take party damage. At high keys, it's probably going to be more necessary to either move away the boss or move away yourself as you're spawning the orbs, so you have more time to soak. You can delay the explosions a little bit more. Last week on Fortified, people would just insta-soak them and whatever, but if you do it on Tyrannical, if you do it on higher keys, you are probably just gonna kill yourself. The real tough problems were the 2 middle ones, Tarvold and Berilla. Tarvold, of course, has a super, probably a little bit overtuned, high-hitting ability, the single target Castigate. Number 1, it kills people because clowns don't know what to do, stay in the party and kill everyone. And even when you do know what to do, you have to use a defensive to sort of survive this at higher keys, because it hits quite hard, and then you get the party-wide AoE when the ad spawns. But when a target has Castigate, so he has to move away, and then you have the 2 orbs running around the circle corridors that you have to dodge, and then you have to focus down the ad. It's a lot of damage with a lot of movement. It's pretty hectic, and it becomes pretty difficult in Tyrannical. The 3rd boss, the one you do right after, really just has 2 problems. Number 1, Iron Spikes, the burst damage on the tank, which is very, very high and requires a lot of attention. And then number 2, the Rite of Supremacy, the big blow-up that you need to soak, resist basically by taking orbs. People have been slacking, I've seen, on this mechanic. You have to get, at 10 and 11, 3 of them without a defensive. Higher than that, you have to start using a defensive on top of that, or 4 of them at the very least. So it does become pretty tough later on in Tyrannical keys. But that being said, we still have a 65% success chance. 2 out of 3 times you are running Sanguine Depths, you're being successful. So that's pretty surprising compared to the state it was in before. No other dungeon has had this much of a change. The only one being somewhat closer is Spires of Ascension. When we look at the popularity, Mists of Tir Nasid is still the more popular dungeon. Before, it was the more popular. Now, it is still at 35,000 dungeons completed. Same goes for the 2nd more popular, Halls of Atonement. Halls of Atonement is still the 2nd more popular dungeon, 28,000 of them completed. And after that, we get a big jump, a big gap from the 34 and 28 of Mists and Halls of Atonement to the 20,000 of Spires of Ascension. Spires of Ascension wasn't the more popular last week. It has gotten a big jump now. What is really interesting, though, is Sanguine Depths. Again, despite making such a big success chance increase, despite being the second most successful dungeon this week, Sanguine Depths is the least run dungeon. Sanguine Depths was basically the second least run dungeon last week, just behind the other side. This week, though, they went all the way down to 14,000, so even the other side is doing better. I repeat, the other side has a 27% success rate, Sanguine Depths has a 65% success rate, nearly almost 3 times as much, yet it is still run less. I've heard some comments about, best in slot items, people targeting certain dungeons, but this goes for every spec, guys. There's gonna be hunters with their weapons, there's going to be casters with their weapons, with staffs, there's gonna be trinkets for agility, for strength, for intellect, there's gonna be daggers, so there's gonna be pretty much one best in slot per dungeon per every spec, somewhere. So it's not enough to make this much of a difference. So in the end, we see that Mists continues to be the easiest dungeon and the other side continues to be the hardest dungeon to complete, regardless of the week, regardless of the affixes so far. There's been no change. Mist is still king and other side is still, nightmare. In the middle, we still have a big chunk of dungeons being somewhat at the same level. Last week we had Theater of Pain and Plagueful being pretty close to each other. They still are. This time they are joined by Spires of Ascension and Necrotic Wake. They were much lower in percentage in success chance last week. This time they have gotten much better. And then we have the real biggest change being Sanguine Depths, jumping past all of them and putting itself second in success chance compared to all the other dungeons, only behind Mists, which will, I guess, eventually have to be buffed in some way. Now, what you have just seen was the current week in Mythic Plus. Not much to say about spec representation because not really much has changed. I'm gonna flash them over for you, but really it's about the same as last week, not enough changes. We will have to wait probably for some 20 or so item levels, maybe the next tier with some balance changes, class tuning and whatnot, because right now it's probably gonna stay the same depending on how far people can push their keys. Maybe we will reach some walls. Maybe Demon Hunter Vengeance will start taking too much damage and they have to be switched for some more defensive specs like Guardian or Brewmaster. Maybe Resto Shaman will not be able to cut it anymore without strong externals, so they will start losing their relevance, but for now it looks like it's going to stay this way. So this is where we're going to stop. Let me know which one of the dungeons in here you refuse to acknowledge. Let me know if you're convinced that Sanguine Depths is still a trap and the win rate it shows it's a lie and it's totally 20%, or the opposite, if for you the other side was super easy. Maybe if you have found a group, a comp that makes a certain dungeon very easy, just let me know, let us know, let everyone know, that would help. Remember that only if you subscribe, like, and donate to my charity foundation for depleted keys, you can get the exclusive tickets for my first ASMR concert. With this, I am fleeing, I leave you here, I abandon you, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, it's almost Christmas, where is my snow?